Petey Chapter 7. After supper, Calvin's interrogation of Petey continued. He finally determined that food on Petey's sheet had lured the mice. "I'll clean your sheet before we go to bed," Calvin said, "and stay awake to help you chase away the mice." "Goo, goo," Petey grunted. "'Cause I can wake you up easier, let me watch first." Petey nodded. That night, Petey fell asleep even before the lights were off. It seemed only minutes before Calvin's voice stole into his dreams. "Hey, Petey, wake up." Petey blinked, staring into the darkness. "Wake up, Petey, it's your turn. I can't stay awake no more. I chased away 3 mice. Are you awake, Petey?" "Aye, aye," Petey squeaked as quietly as he could. For a week, the watch continued. Soon, the mice quit coming. Except for Calvin brushing crumbs from Petey's sheet, the two no longer kept their nightly vigil. Petey missed his little friends and worried about Esteban and Sally, his 2 favorites. They had been like a family. Now their loss brought painful tears. Petey craved the family. It was as if his mind knew of love and devotion, but the feelings must have been only his imagination. Nothing Petey remembered was ever so special. Calvin had satisfied part of this void. Though retarded, his shortcomings were offset by sheer determination. Calvin doggedly deciphered Peter's grunts and gestures until he captured basic notions. With effort, he wove the notions like threads into an idea, eventually forming a concept. Once captured, Petey and Calvin paraded the shared understanding back and forth between them like proud captors of a snared rabbit. Calvin's tenacity made him a dreaded presence on the ward. His endless questions and opinions tested each patient's endurance. In his spare time, Calvin began disassembling everything he touched. He never quite remembered how to reassemble his destruction. The last straw fell the day he reduced his wheelchair to scattered tires, pads, tubes, and a headrest. "Calvin," the attendant scolded, "knock it off. You take one more thing apart, and I'll take your wheelchair away, and you can stay in bed. You hear me?" Reluctantly, Calvin agreed. After that, he began grabbing the handles on Petey's wheelchair and shoving him a few feet. Wheeling himself forward, he repeated this motion. Soon, Calvin could position both chairs near the windows without depending on the attendant. He spent full afternoons pushing Petey around the ward. One day, Calvin spun Petey in circles. Petey flailed his arms and grunted to stop, but Calvin spun him faster and faster. When he finally let the dizzy Petey roll to a stop, Petey threw up all over himself. "Oh boy," Calvin exclaimed, "if you did that when I was spinning you, it would have splattered everyone." Petey mustered his most severe scowl. Late one afternoon, Calvin wheeled up to Petey. "Hey, Petey, I've been thinking. You got to learn more words. If you can say yes, no, and good, you can say other stuff too." Petey shook his head. But as he sat alone staring out the windows, he began mouthing words he'd heard. It took so much effort to close his lips that he could not make a sound at the same time. His throat felt like something gripped it in a clamp. The biggest problem was his tongue. Jutting sideways in his mouth, the tongue gnarled about, defying any command. When forming words, it fell short of contacting the top of his mouth, leaving air to rush past. It helped to press his bottom lip against his upper gum. Petey realized the best way to make any good sound was the way he said "aye," "oh," and "goo." He had to use his throat. The first success came with the words "pretty good." Swirling his cheeks back and almost humming, he grunted out a very rough "fur goo." He could utter this without using his tongue. Over and over he practiced. The next morning, Calvin wheeled over. "Hi, Petey, how are you?" "Fur goo," Petey grunted. Calvin stared. "Fur goo." Calvin tipped his head sideways. "You telling me something?" Petey nodded. Calvin skewed his face thoughtfully and scratched his head. "Let me think. I asked how you was doing, and you said, 'Fur goo.' You mean pretty good?" "Aye, aye." Calvin broke out laughing. Petey smiled and puckered his cheeks again in a guttural but jubilant, "Fur goo, fur goo." The next day, Petey learned the word goodbye. Unable to say goodnight, this was the nearest thing he could think of. Again, it exacted great effort, but he grunted out a coarse "goo-bah." Before long, the whole world listened each night to the goodnight salutation conducted in the 2 corner beds. "Good night, Petey. Goo-bah." The joy of learning to communicate with Calvin helped temper Petey's loss of the mice. But Petey worried about Calvin. The boy either boiled over with motion and laughter or sat secluded in total silence. Some days he spent whole mornings at the day room table, slumped over, head tucked in his arms. Each day, Petey sat silently by the window. Often he watched the round glass thing on the wall. During the last year, the object had captivated his attention, holding him spellbound for long hours at a time. The device had two little levers or rods. One of the levers was longer than the other. The longest one went around and around, maybe a dozen or more times each day. The shorter one barely moved. If lucky, it went around once. Petey learned to predict meal times by watching the levers. Watching the movement of the levers became more satisfying than looking out the windows. The windows left him longing to reach out his hand and touch the wind or feel the sun against his face. The old memories of his trip over from infant's ward had dulled in his mind, and with each rotation of the lever, the memories came more from imagination. Maybe he never really felt the sun and wind. One day, blustery weather rolled in over the grounds. Wind howled down from a threatening sky. As Calvin and Petey sat together on the far end of the ward, Calvin began clowning around. "Look how I can spin," he said, pushing opposite directions on his tires. The chair rammed the wall and tipped over. Calvin pitched forward and fell from the chair. With a dull thud, his head hit the wooden floor. He groaned and struggled to get up, and then collapsed and lay still. Petey grunted and tried to wave his arms, but nobody noticed. He sat frozen in numbed silence. His best friend needed help, and all he could do was sit helplessly in his wheelchair and grunt like an idiot.